The third call came in while we were conducting live fire certification on Range 7, and I almost didn't hear about it until the following morning. My communications sergeant, Voss, mentioned it during the 0545 brief like it was nothing. Sir, Relay Station 9 picked up another inbound on the Colonial Distress frequency last night. Third one this week. Automated bounce to regional. No action taken. I told him to pull the log and put it on my desk. He looked at me for a half-second too long before he said yes, sir, and that was the first wrong thing. Voss never hesitated. I commanded the 4th Territorial Response Group out of Camp Macon, a garrison installation 40 minutes by air from the nearest population center and responsible for monitoring 17 inactive colonial sites across a landmass roughly the size of France. Most of those sites had been formally decommissioned between 15 and 40 years ago. The populations had been resettled, the infrastructure stripped or left to weather, and the administrative files archived. My unit's job was maintenance of the monitoring network, environmental survey, and, in theory, emergency response to any renewed activity. In 8 years of command, I had never responded to anything. The colonial distress frequencies existed on paper. Equipment received them. Nobody called. The log Voss put on my desk was a single page. 3 calls in 6 days, each lasting between 90 and 120 seconds. Each originating from Site 11, a mining settlement called Harkins Reach, abandoned in 2009, population formally resettled to the coastal cities, infrastructure classified as non-recoverable. The frequency was correct. The encoding was correct. The content field was blank because no one had been assigned to listen. The automated system logged the signal, bounced an acknowledgement, and filed it. That was all it was designed to do. I called Regional Communications Division at 0730 and spoke with a duty officer named Terrell. I asked if anyone had flagged the Harkins Reach signals. He checked, came back, and told me no. He said the system was functioning as designed. Signals received, logged, bounced. I asked what the acknowledgement message said, what words went back to whoever was calling. He checked again. A longer pause this time. It says, "Your call has been received. Remain in place. Assistance is being coordinated." Then it loops. How long does it loop? Until the caller disconnects. I asked him who wrote that response script. He said it was standard. Part of the original emergency communications package installed across all colonial sites at establishment. I asked if anyone had ever updated it. He said no. There was no reason to. The colonies were extinct. I thanked him, hung up, and sat at my desk for several minutes before doing anything else. The word extinct was doing something in my head that I didn't like. I'd used it myself. Everyone did. It was the official classification, colony extinct. It meant the charter was dissolved, the population was resettled, and the site was no longer a living administrative entity. It did not mean everyone was dead. It meant the place was dead. But someone was calling from inside it. I assembled a team of 6 for what I designated a routine monitoring inspection, the fastest authorization pathway that didn't require regional approval. Voss handled communications. Sergeant Okafor led the security element, for soldiers with standard patrol loadout. I went because I wanted to see the site myself, and because I hadn't left Camp Mackin for anything operational in 14 months, and because something about the hesitation in Voss's face had gotten under my skin. The flight to Harkins Reach took 2 hours and 40 minutes in a heavy transport. I sat in the back with Okafor and reviewed the site file on my tablet. Harkins Reach had been a mineral extraction colony, rare earth elements primarily, established in 1987 with a peak population of roughly 4,200. The mine had played out by 2005. Resettlement had been completed by 2009. The final census showed 0 remaining residents. The infrastructure assessment from the same year listed all structures as degraded beyond economic recovery. The site had been visited twice since then, once in 2014 for a routine environmental sample, and once in 2019 when a satellite flagged what turned out to be a brush fire. I noticed that the 2019 visit report was filed by a Captain Linden. I recognized the name. Elise Linden had been my wife's closest friend during our posting at Camp Mackin. She'd transferred out in 2021. I made a mental note to find her report. We landed on what had been the colony's main transit pad, cracked concrete overgrown with dry scrub, but still flat enough for a stable touchdown. The air was hot and thin. The settlement spread below us in a shallow valley, rows of prefabricated housing blocks arranged in a grid, a central administrative cluster, the mine head visible as a dark scar on the eastern ridge. From the air, it had looked dead. On the ground, it looked dead in the specific way that bothered me, dead and maintained. Not maintained well. Not maintained recently. But the roads between the housing blocks had been cleared at some point. The vegetation was cut back from the main structures in a way that weather alone would not have produced. Okafor noticed it too. He didn't say anything, but he adjusted the spacing of his team without being told. The communications relay was housed in the administrative cluster, a squat concrete building with a reinforced antenna mast. Voss went straight for it. I gave him 20 minutes and walked the perimeter with Okafor. No vehicles, Okafor said. No tracks. No waste. No people, I said. No recent people, he corrected. Which was the right distinction. Someone had been here. The question was when. Voss called me back. He was inside the relay building, standing in front of a console that should not have been powered. But it was. A single green indicator light, steady. The rest of the equipment was dark, dead, corroded at the connections. But one module, the emergency broadcast unit, was drawing power from somewhere and showing active status. "It's receiving," Voss said, "and transmitting. The automated response loop is live. It's been live this entire time." "Since when?" He checked the maintenance log stored in the unit's local memory. The last manual entry was from 2009. Decommission confirmation. But the unit had never actually been powered down. Someone had signed off on the decommission without completing it. Or the unit had restarted itself. Or, "There's an independent power source," Voss said. He pointed to a cable running from the back of the console into the floor. "Not part of the original installation. Added later. Cleanly installed. Professional work." I ordered Okafor to trace the cable. It ran underground, beneath the admin building, and emerged on the far side heading east, toward the mine. We followed it on foot for 400 meters before it entered a junction box mounted on a post that hadn't been part of the original colony infrastructure. The junction box was new. Not new as in last week. New as in last decade. Weathered but sound, properly sealed, with a maintenance tag wired to the handle. The tag read, "Serviced, 2024. I stared at it. Okafor stared at it. 2 years ago. Someone had been here 2 years ago and serviced this power junction that was feeding the emergency communications relay in a colony that had been officially dead for 17 years. "Sir," Okafor said carefully, "this is infrastructure maintenance." He was right. This wasn't squatters. This wasn't scavengers. This was someone performing scheduled technical upkeep on a system that, according to every official record, did not exist. I photographed the tag, the junction box, the cable run. Then I told Voss to pull the full signal log from the emergency unit, not just the 3 recent calls, but everything. Every inbound and outbound signal since 2009. It took him 40 minutes. When he came back, his face had the same expression it had the morning he'd hesitated at the briefing table, except worse. He handed me the tablet without speaking. The log showed 3,847 inbound calls over 17 years. Irregular intervals. Sometimes clusters of 10 or 15 in a single week, then months of silence. Every single one had been received, acknowledged with the automated loop, and filed. Every single one had originated from within the Harkins Reach site. And every single one had been logged by the regional system and never flagged, never reviewed, never actioned. 3,847 times, someone had called for help from a place that didn't exist, and a machine had told them to remain in place and wait. I reported the findings to Regional that evening by encrypted uplink from the transport. I spoke with Colonel Asha, my direct superior, and laid out the facts without interpretation. Independent power supply. Maintained infrastructure. 17 years of distress calls. Asha listened without interruption, which was unusual for him. When I finished, He asked one question. Did you enter the mine? I said no. We hadn't had time. He said fine. He told me to return to Camp Mackin, file a preliminary report, and wait for guidance. He said he'd escalate to Territorial Command. He said I should not discuss the findings with anyone outside my team until the report was reviewed. I asked him directly, "Has anyone else reported on Harkin's Reach?" A pause. Then, "File your report, Major. I'll be in touch." He cut the link. And that was the second wrong thing. Not what he said. What he didn't ask. He didn't ask who was making the calls. He didn't ask if anyone was in danger. He didn't ask if we needed to go back. He asked about the mine, and then he told me to stop. That night at Camp Mackin, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the junction box tag. Serviced, 2024. Someone in my area of responsibility was performing infrastructure maintenance on a site I was responsible for monitoring, and I had never known about it. I had never been told. My unit had never been tasked. Which meant either someone else had authority over that site, authority that superseded mine without my knowledge, or my own chain of command had been conducting operations in my territory without informing me. Neither answer was acceptable. Both were possible. I found Captain Linden's 2019 report the next morning. It was in the archive, properly filed, properly formatted. Routine brush fire investigation. 3 pages. No anomalies noted. Site confirmed uninhabited. Structures consistent with advanced decay. Recommendation: no further action. I read it 3 times. Then I called Elise Linden. She'd left the service in 2022 and was working in private security consulting in the capital. She picked up after 4 rings. "Mira," she said, using my first name. We hadn't spoken in 2 years. Not since Caro's funeral. "I need to ask about Harkin's Reach," I said. The silence lasted long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. "Are you on a secure line?" she asked. "No, then I can't help you. I'm sorry." And she hung up. I sat with that for a long time. Elise had been Caro's friend. She'd been at the hospital at the end. She'd held my hand at the service. And she'd just shut me down with a fear in her voice I had never heard from her before. Elise Linden, who had once talked down an armed deserter in a hallway with nothing but her voice and her rank. Caro. My wife. Dead 14 months from a blood cancer that had come fast and brutal and wrong. Wrong because she'd been healthy. Wrong because the military physicians had seemed unsurprised. Wrong because she tried to tell me something in those last weeks, when the morphine was high and her words were fragments, and I'd held her hand and told her to rest. I'd thought it was the drugs. I'd thought she was confused. She kept saying the ground. She kept saying they know. I'd thought she meant God. Caro had been a geological survey officer. She had worked on site assessments for colonial decommissioning. She had worked on Harkin's Reach. I went back 3 days later. This time without authorization. Voss and Okafor both refused to stay behind once I told them what I was doing, which was insubordinate and the most loyal thing either of them had ever done for me. We took a light utility aircraft, filed a flight plan for a routine antenna inspection at a different site, and diverted. We entered the mine at 1,400 hours. The main shaft had been sealed with a concrete plug at decommission, standard procedure, but the plug had been removed. Not broken. Removed. The bolts that had held the sealing frame were backed out cleanly. The frame was leaned against the wall beside the entrance, as though someone planned to replace it when they were done. Inside, the shaft descended at a steady 12-degree grade for approximately 600 meters before opening into the first extraction gallery. Our lights showed clean walls, dry floor, intact support timbers. The mine should have been flooded or partially collapsed after 17 years of neglect. It wasn't. It was in better condition than the surface structures. Someone had been maintaining it. At the 700-meter mark, we found the first door. Not a mine door. A security door. Steel, institutional gray, with an electronic lock and a small camera housing above the frame. The camera was active. I could see the tiny red indicator. The lock had a keycard reader. "That's military hardware," Okafor said. He was right. The lock system was the same model we used at Camp Mackin. I recognized the manufacturer's mark. I tried my access card. It worked. Behind the door was a corridor, poured concrete, fluorescent lighting, climate-controlled. It ran straight for perhaps 200 meters before branching. The air was cool and processed. It smelled institutional, recycled atmosphere, cleaning chemicals, ozone. The floor was clean. The walls were bare except for directional signage at each junction. The signage used standard military nomenclature. Section designators. Floor numbers. We were on level 1. There were 4 levels. We moved through level 1 systematically. It was administrative. Offices, a small mess hall, storage rooms, a communication center more advanced than anything at Camp Mackin. The equipment was current generation. Some of it was models I'd only seen in procurement catalogs, but never been authorized to order. Everything was powered. Everything was functioning. But there were no people. The desks had personal effects, photographs, mugs, a sweater draped over a chair. The mess hall had food in the refrigerators, some of it fresh. The communication center showed active data streams, encrypted, running to destinations I couldn't identify. Someone worked here. Many people worked here. They had left recently, or they were somewhere deeper. In the communication center, Voss found something that made him swear, the first time I'd ever heard him break composure on an operation. He pointed to a display. It showed the emergency broadcast system status for the entire colonial network, all 17 sites in my area of responsibility. 14 of them showed active signal traffic. Not just Harkin's reach. 14 colonies, officially extinct, were receiving and transmitting distress calls. And this facility was monitoring all of them from a central hub. "Sir," Voss said, "this is a command center. This is running the whole network." I understood then. The emergency hotlines weren't a leftover. They weren't a forgotten system still running on residual power. They were actively operated. Someone was receiving those distress calls. Someone was listening. Someone had built an entire military-grade installation underground to manage communications from places that officially did not exist, from people who officially were not there. And my access card had opened the door. Level 2 was medical. I knew it by the smell before I saw the signage. That specific combination of antiseptic and recycled air that belongs only to clinical spaces. The corridor opened into a ward. 30 beds, arranged in a standard field hospital configuration. 12 of them were occupied. The patients were asleep or sedated. Their vital signs showed on monitors beside each bed, stable, rhythmic, unremarkable. They wore standard hospital gowns. They had 4 lines running clear fluid. Their charts hung on clipboards at the foot of each bed. I picked up the nearest chart. The patient's name was Gregor Harkin. Colony of origin, Harkin's Reach. Resettlement status, complete. Current classification, returned. Returned. Not a medical term. Not a standard personnel classification. I checked another chart. Same format. Colony of origin, Harkin's Reach. Status, returned. A third. A fourth. All the same. These were people from the dead colony. People who had been officially resettled. People who had, at some point, gone back. And someone had put them in beds and hooked them to machines and classified them with a word that didn't appear in any manual I'd ever read. Okafor was checking the supply room. He came back with a look I'd never seen on him, not fear exactly, but the kind of professional blankness that covers something a soldier doesn't want to process on mission. "Blood stores," he said. "Tissue samples. Bone marrow. Labeled with colony site numbers. Not just Harkin's Reach. Multiple sites." I told him to photograph everything. I told Voss to download whatever he could from the communication center upstairs. And I went to Level 3. Level 3 was research. Laboratories. Equipment I didn't have the background to identify, though some of it was clearly geological. Core samples, spectrographic analysis stations, mineral processing arrays. The core samples were labeled with depth markers that went far beyond anything a mineral extraction operation would have produced. These were samples from kilometers below the mine's original depth. Someone had kept drilling long after the colony was decommissioned. Someone was still pulling material from deep underground and studying it. One laboratory had a whiteboard covered in notations. I photographed it without understanding most of it. But one phrase was written in large letters across the top, circled twice: exposure pathway confirmed, geological uptake. Beneath it, a list of colony site numbers. 14 sites. The same 14 showing active signal traffic on level 1. And then in a different hand, smaller, latency, 5 to 15 years. Presentation, hematological. I read it twice. I read it 3 times. Hematological. Blood. Blood cancer. A latency period of 5 to 15 years between exposure and presentation. Caro had worked the geological surveys at Harkins Reach in 2008. She had gotten sick in 2023. 15 years. I sat down on the laboratory floor. Okafor found me there 4 minutes later and didn't say anything. He just stood by the door and waited until I stood up again. Level 4 was locked. My access card didn't work. There was a second reader beside the first, biometric, palm scan. I stood in front of it and felt something shift in my understanding of why I was here. My card had opened the first door. The system knew me. My access level was already programmed into this facility. I existed somewhere in its records, authorized to enter, expected. Which meant someone in my chain of command, possibly Asha, possibly higher, had always known this place existed and had always anticipated that I might come. I put my palm on the scanner. It beeped. Green light. The door opened. Level 4 was smaller. A single corridor, 4 rooms. The first room was a conference space with a long table and 16 chairs. The second was a server room, active, humming. The third was a file archive. The fourth was an office. On the desk was a nameplate, Colonel M. Asha, Site Director. I stood in my commanding officer's secret office inside an illegal underground facility built within a mine that had poisoned my wife, and I felt something between rage and the total cessation of surprise. Because of course it was him. Of course the man who told me to stop looking was the man who ran what I'd found. The architecture of the concealment was elegant in its simplicity. Put the monitoring commander directly under the authority of the site commander. Make the watchdog answer to the wolf. On Asha's desk, a personnel file. Mine. Flagged with a notation I didn't recognize. A numeric code followed by the word eligible. Beneath it, Caro's file. Same code. Same word. But hers was crossed out, and beside the crossout, a date, the date of her death. Eligible. For what? I opened the desk drawer. Inside was a single document, a one-page directive, classification level I'd never seen, authorizing managed return protocols for colonial populations exposed to subsurface geological contaminants. The directive's logic was clear even in its bureaucratic language. The contaminant caused illness. The illness was traceable. The exposed populations, once resettled, would eventually present symptoms that could be linked to their colonial service. This was a liability. The solution was to manage the exposure cohort through voluntary return and contained monitoring, bring them back to the site, keep them in the underground facility, treat them, study them, and keep them off civilian medical rolls where their cancers would become a pattern that somebody might notice. The distress calls. The hotline. The automated message. Remain in place. Assistance is being coordinated. People were getting sick. People were calling the only number they'd ever been given. And a machine was telling them to wait while an underground system decided whether to bring them in or let them die in the civilian world where their deaths would be scattered, individual, unremarkable. Caro had not been brought in. Caro had been allowed to die. Voss found me reading the directive. He downloaded what he could from level 1 and wanted to leave. Okafor had reported movement on the surface, a vehicle approach, still distant. Someone was coming. Probably triggered by our entry. Probably triggered an hour ago when my card opened the first door and registered somewhere. "Sir, we need to go," Voss said. I took the directive. I took my personnel file and Caro's. I took photographs of Asha's office. And I went back up through the levels, past the laboratories with their core samples and their whiteboard equations, past the ward where 12 people lay sedated under a classification that didn't exist, past the communication center that was managing distress calls from 14 dead colonies, and out through the mine shaft into daylight that felt like a physical blow. The vehicle Okafor had spotted was a military transport, same model as ours, same markings. It was on the ground near the transit pad, rotors still turning. 3 figures stood beside it. Even at 400 meters, I recognized Asha's posture. We had a choice. Run for our aircraft and try to leave before they could respond. Or walk toward them and have the conversation. Okafor looked at me. Voss looked at me. Both were ready for either option. Both understood that this was not the kind of situation where the right choice existed. I walked toward them. Asha met me at the midpoint between the 2 aircraft. 2 security officers flanked him, not soldiers I recognized, not from Camp Mackin. Private contractors, maybe. Or personnel from whatever parallel structure operated this facility. Mira, he said. He used my first name, which he never did. I knew this would happen eventually. I told them your access should have been revoked when Caroline died. You killed her. No, he said it without defensiveness. Like correcting a minor factual error in a report. The ground killed her. The mineral seam runs beneath 14 sites. It's been outgassing a compound we still don't fully understand for longer than the colonies existed. Everyone who lived on those sites for more than 2 years was exposed. We didn't cause it. We discovered it. And you covered it. We managed it. There's a difference. 12 people in beds, Asha. Sedated. Treated. Contained. Alive. He took a step closer. Do you know what happens if this goes public? 42,000 resettled colonists. All exposed. All carrying a latent condition that may or may not activate. You release that information and you cause a panic that crashes the entire colonial medical system, bankrupts the territorial government in liability claims, and most importantly, does not save anyone. There is no cure. There is only monitoring and managed care for those who present symptoms. Caro presented symptoms. You didn't manage her. His face changed then. Not guilt, exactly. Something colder. Administrative regret. Caroline was flagged for return. She refused. She told us she'd go public if we approached her again. So we stepped back. And her illness progressed in civilian care. And she died. And we lost the opportunity to study her progression, which might have helped the others. He paused. I am sorry about that. Genuinely. She was a good officer. But she made a choice. She made a choice. The same way the system described it in its own language, voluntary return. As if there was anything voluntary about being poisoned, getting sick, and being offered a secret underground hospital as the only alternative to dying in public. What's eligible mean in my file? I asked. Asha looked at me steadily. You lived at Camp Mackin for 8 years, Mira. Mackin is 40 minutes from Harkin's Reach. The mineral seam doesn't stop at the colony boundary. The outgassing zone is larger than the original assessment suggested. The ground beneath my feet. 8 years of breathing this air. 8 years of drinking this water. I'm exposed, I said. You're eligible for monitoring. Early detection. Managed care if it presents. He gestured toward the mine entrance. That's what this facility is for. That's what all of this is for. Not malice. Triage. I stood on dead ground with poison in my lungs and my commanding officer offering me a bed in a secret hospital and a lifetime of silence, and I thought about Caro. I thought about her refusing. I thought about what it had cost her. I thought about the 12 people downstairs who hadn't refused, who were alive and sedated and studied. I thought about 42,000 people in the coastal cities who didn't know what was inside them. I thought about the phone calls, 3,847 calls from people getting sick, calling the only number they had, being told to wait. Asha was watching me. Patient. He'd done this before. I could see it in his posture. He'd had this conversation with others. He probably had it with Caro, and she'd said no, and he'd written her off. Here's what happens now, he said. You go back to Camp Mackin. You file a report that says the signals were equipment malfunction, a relay stuck in loop mode from a power surge. Your team signs off. The flights don't appear in any record that matters. And you enter the monitoring program. Voluntary. Quiet. You get blood work every 6 months. If anything develops, we catch it early. You live. And the 42,000? Not your responsibility. Not your problem to solve. There is no solution. There is only management. And if I don't agree? He didn't answer immediately. One of the contractors shifted his weight. It was subtle, professional. The suggestion of physical consequence without the explicit threat. Asha noticed my eyes track the movement and shook his head slightly. Nothing dramatic, he said. You'd be reassigned. Remote posting. Your report would be filed and sealed. Your team would be separated and redistributed. And you would not receive the monitoring. Which means if it develops, you'd find out the way Caroline did, too late for anything but morphine. Not a threat. A withdrawal of care. The system's final tool, not violence, but the removal of the only safety it controlled. Cooperate and be watched over. Refuse and be alone with whatever was growing in your blood. Voss and Okafor were behind me. I could feel them waiting. 2 men who had followed me into a place they shouldn't have gone, who now knew what I knew, and who were also, I realized with a nausea that wasn't only fear, also exposed. 8 years at Camp Macon. Both of them. Every soldier in my unit. Every family on that base. If I refused Asha and went public, and if anyone believed me, a large if, given classification levels and institutional power, the result would be exactly what he described. Panic. 42,000 people knowing they were poisoned with no available treatment. The monitoring program dissolved. The 12 patients downstairs abandoned or exposed. My own people, Voss and Okafor and all the rest, cut off from the only early detection system that existed. And Karo would still be dead. And the ground would still be poisoned. And nothing would be fixed. Or I could cooperate. File the false report. Enter the monitoring program. Keep my people within the system's care, because I was sure, absolutely sure, that Asha's offer extended to them by implication. Stay quiet, and everyone gets watched. Everyone gets the early blood draws, the scans, the intervention if it comes. Refuse, and not just me but everyone around me loses that protection. It wasn't a choice between truth and silence. It was a choice between principled disclosure that helped no one and complicit silence that might save the people I was responsible for. I looked at Asha and hated him with a clarity that felt like light. Not because he was wrong. Because he wasn't entirely wrong. Because the logic worked. Because the system he'd built, monstrous, secret, unaccountable, was also the only system that was doing anything for the people it had poisoned. I want my entire unit in the monitoring program, I said. Not just my team. Everyone at Macon. Every soldier, every dependent, every civilian contractor. Full enrollment. Documented internally, at whatever classification level you need. But documented. Asha considered. Then he nodded. I want the automated response changed. Anyone who calls gets a human being. Within the hour. Someone who can actually coordinate their return. Another nod. Slower. And I want Caro's case file. Everything you have on her. Her exposure assessment, her refusal, her progression data. All of it. Why? Because she's my wife. Because I'm going to read it. Because that's the cost of my cooperation, and it's not negotiable. He looked at me for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket and handed me a keycard, different from my standard issue, black, unmarked. Level 4 archive. Third room. Her file is in the second cabinet. He said it like he'd known I would ask. Like it had been in the drawer waiting for me. I took the card. I turned around. Voss and Okafor fell in beside me without a word. We walked back to our aircraft in silence. I filed the report the next morning. Equipment malfunction. Relay loop caused by power surge from degraded solar cells. Signal cleared. No further action required. Voss co-signed. Okafor co-signed. The report went up to regional, was acknowledged, and disappeared into the archive. 3 days later, every member of my unit received a notification of enrollment in an enhanced preventive health monitoring program, described as a pilot initiative for personnel in remote postings. Blood work every 6 months. Full panel. Nobody questioned it. People were grateful, mostly. A few made jokes about the military finally caring about their health. I read Caro's file on a Tuesday night in my quarters with the door locked and a bottle of whiskey I didn't open. Her exposure assessment was from 2008, a single page noting elevated contact with subsurface outgassing during geological survey operations at Site 11. Risk level, moderate. Recommendation, periodic monitoring. The monitoring had never been implemented because the program hadn't existed yet in 2008. It was built later, after more data, after more people got sick. By the time the system was ready to help her, she had already left the service, already been told what she was carrying, already refused to come back. Her refusal was documented in a single paragraph. She stated that she would not participate in any program that required secrecy about the exposure of colonial populations. She stated that she intended to disclose publicly. She was informed that disclosure would result in termination of monitoring access and potential legal consequences under classification statutes. She maintained her position. Then nothing. A gap of 3 years. Then her medical records from civilian hospitals. The diagnosis. The progression, the death, all recorded by the facility as an observational case, unmanaged, untreated by their protocols, tracked at a distance. They had watched her die from the outside, made notes, added her data to their models. At the bottom of the file, a handwritten annotation in what I recognized as Asha's script, outcome regrettable. Data value, significant. Exposure pathway confirmation via unmanaged progression. File closed. I closed the file. I opened the whiskey. I drank one glass. Then I sealed the file in my personal safe and went to bed. The calls from Harkin's Reach stopped 2 weeks later. Voss confirmed that the automated response system had been updated, a live operator line, routed through the Level 1 communication center, staffed around the clock. I didn't ask how I knew this. I didn't ask who was answering. I didn't visit the site again. Every 6 months, I give blood. Every 6 months, I wait for results. So far, nothing. Voss is clear. Okafor is clear. One sergeant in my motor pool showed early markers last year and was quietly transferred to specialist medical care at a regional facility. I know where he actually went. I signed the transfer paperwork with full knowledge that I was sending him underground. He called me last month. He sounded tired but alive. He said the treatment was working. He said thank you for catching it early. He said the food wasn't bad, but he missed the sky. I said I was glad he was doing well. I said I'd visit if I could. I don't know if that was true. Some nights I lie awake and calculate. 8 years of exposure. Moderate to high contact based on Macken's proximity to the seam. Latency of 5 to 15 years. I'm in year 9. The window is open. It may stay open for another 6 years. Every clear blood panel is a reprieve, not an answer. And somewhere underneath this ground, in a facility that my keycard still opens, people are being kept alive by a system that poisoned them and then hid the evidence. And I maintain that system now. Not by working in it. By being silent about it. By filing false reports. By sending my people into it when their blood turns wrong. By accepting the bargain. Caro refused. Caro is dead. I don't know if those two facts are causally connected or merely correlated. The file suggests correlation. My gut says otherwise. But my gut is not evidence, and I have become, in these months since Harkin's Reach, a person who requires evidence before acting. Because action without evidence in this context means panic, collapse, 42,000 people with no support, and the dissolution of the only medical infrastructure that's keeping my sergeant alive underground. I made the right choice. I made the only choice. I made a monstrous choice. These 3 statements are simultaneously true, and I hold all of them in my head at once every single morning when I walk to my office and sit down at my desk and open my terminal and see the signal logs from 17 sites, 14 of which I now know are active graves full of living people, and I do nothing. I do nothing because doing nothing is the action that preserves the most lives. And I do nothing because I am afraid of what my blood will show next April, and I want to be inside the system when it does. That is the truth. Not principle. Not courage. Fear. I chose silence because silence keeps me alive. And every day I live with that is a day I understand why Caro couldn't. She was braver than me. She is dead. I am not brave. I am here. The system continues. And I am part of it now.